The promise that the fourth bridge would allow speedy services through Scotland ran into a hefty snag soon after opening. Many of the routes leading to it had not planned for the extra traffic, and this created bottlenecks all over the lowlands. The most significant was Edinburgh Waverley Station. The station, in 1890, consisted of 4 platforms and 2 through lines. But now that the through traffic towards the bridge was added to the traffic running to the north of England and to Glasgow, the small platforms were simply not capable of handling everything, and long traffic jams built up of trains waiting for space. It was joked by guidebooks that travellers wishing to arrive on time ought to set off the previous day. Following appeals, the government provided funding to expand the station, and expand it they did. By 1895, the station had built up to 18 platforms and 6 through lines. Edinburgh Waverley was now, and still is, Britain's largest station outside of London. Now that the North British Railway could finally run speedy services up to Dundee and Aberdeen, this had the effect of reigniting the race to the north. Up until now, the West Coast Main Line had been the only means of travelling up to Aberdeen without changing trains. Their fastest was an overnight express which left Euston at 8 p.m. and arrived at 7:40 a.m. But now the Tay and Forth bridges allowed the East Coast Partnership to run their own direct services, and their route was 45 kilometres shorter. In 1895, they set up an overnight express, setting off at the same time as the West Coast Overnight Express, but arriving at 7:20 a.m. The West Coast rapidly set up a service arriving at 7 o'clock. Both soon pushed down further to 6:45. But shortening the timetables was only the start of it. All through the summer of 1895, the drivers began pushing the trains to the limit in an effort to reach Aberdeen before the other side. Having both set off at the same time made the racing element all the clearer. The final stretch of track was shared between the two sides, so the race would be won based on which side could reach the signal box at Kinnibar Junction first. Several times they arrived within sight of each other. Drivers would ignore the timetables and simply set off as soon as possible, much to the frustration of passengers who wished to board at intermediate stations but found their train had departed early in the hope of winning a race. The companies resolved this by running an additional service to follow along and make the scheduled stops at the correct times. Several of the companies who ran the routes voiced objections to these races, particularly the North British Railway, whose lines were some of the most windy, and attempting a mad rush to the end created a risk of a hideous accident. These concerns were brought to the East Coast Partnership, who spent a few months being conveniently on holiday. But finally they returned and were forced to acknowledge that the North British had a point. The races catered to too few passengers and cost money in service adjustments and in maintenance. The races were brought to an end, and many people breathed a sigh of relief. The problem is that whilst boosting high-speed rail is exciting and headline-grabbing, its application on a medium-sized island is limited. For the majority of actual journeys, the slower, local services are the most important. In this line of thinking, the government passed the Light Railways Act in 1896. Britain was suffering a bit of a recession at the time, and it was felt that this act would stimulate growth in rural areas where mainline railways were not profitable. An earlier act, in 1868, had allowed light railways to be built without having to acquire an Act of Parliament. But this was quite vague on what exactly constituted a light railway. The new Act of 1896 formalised the conditions. A light railway could forego expensive things like signals, crossing gates, and even stations, provided they maintained and enforced a speed limit of 40 km an hour, and had only one engine under steam at any given time. Engines tended to be small and usually narrow gauge, meaning that the track was easy to maintain, and features like bridges could be simple to construct. Several dozen lines were built under this act, They did their job of boosting the local economy, but were never a great commercial success. For a scattered population, using the light railway meant a decent walk to a station which could only take them a short hop to the next town. When motor transport came along, it would quickly prove more versatile for connecting up the rural communities, meaning that the light railways, which were some of the last to be built, would become some of the first to be shut down. It wasn't just the countryside where new light railways were being built. The Glasgow Subway opened in 1896, a 10.5-kilometre loop running under the city. Britain's largest underground railway outside of London. It was one of the last cable-hauled railways built in Britain, though it was electrified in the 1930s. Every platform is of the island type, with track on either side, meaning that the public only ever sees one side of the train. For this reason, its carriages for many years had doors on one side only, to maximise seating. On the surface streets, the nation's tramways were facing a problem. The first great wave of tramways had been largely horse-drawn. Successful as they'd been, a rising urban population was causing the demand for horses to grow faster than the creatures could be bred. What's more, the sounds of thousands of hooves on the cobbled streets was deafening, and the waste the horses produced was becoming increasingly difficult to clean. There was a need for more self-propelled vehicles, but the restrictions placed on steam and cable trams meant that neither could really handle the load. The answer was electricity. Engineers were rapidly working out the kinks with electric transport, and at the same time, many of the 20-year leases on horse and steam trams, which had been set in the 1870s, were starting to run out, and the companies used this as an opportunity to upgrade their systems. Much of the older stock was nearing the end of its shelf life. The steam trams in particular were in a bad state of repair, and the operators were only too happy to see the back of them, though some steam trams stayed in operation until the 1950s. The electric trams proved more than capable of taking over, cheaper, quieter, and more spacious than previous types. Over the course of the 1890s, 34 electric tram networks were built or electrified in the country. Another great uptaker of electricity from this era were subterranean railways, where the advantage of electricity over steam is obvious. In 1890, London's first successful deep-level tube line opened, known as the City and South London Railway, running between Stockwell and King William Street. A tunnelling shield was used to dig deeper than previous lines. This allowed them much more freedom of where the line went, including under the Thames. However, the builders were quite pessimistic. The tunnels were significantly narrower than later deep-level tube lines due to fears of collapse. The line would ultimately have to be rebuilt in order to allow wider trains through. The Central London Railway was completed in 1900, running from Shepherd's Bush to Bank, with trains as long and wide as modern tube travellers would be familiar with. Like many early electric railways, the Central London followed the locomotive system, in which a single powered engine pulls an unpowered string of carriages. It was pulling more weight than previous electric railways had, so some pretty hefty locomotives were installed. But the giant electric motors soon proved a problem. Despite their best efforts to muffle it, the loud and sustained whine from the electric motor would echo through the tunnels, irritating passengers, even travelling through the earth and creating complaints from houses and offices above. After some experimentation, engineers suggested replacing the single large motor with lots of smaller ones, arrayed throughout the train. Not only did this reduce noise, but it revealed further advantages. Multiple unit trains allow for more traction to be applied and more evenly throughout the train. Also, it was possible to be driven from a small cab in the front. With a similar cab in the back, the train could be run in either direction, without having to spend ages turning the locomotive around. The multiple unit arrangement would soon become the standard in Britain's electric railways. Meanwhile, Magnus Volk, who'd introduced electric railways to the country, was looking to expand his line in Brighton all the way to Rottingdean, but some cliffs were blocking his way. Bulk's solution was bizarre. He laid two 82cm gauge tracks on concrete slabs along the beach, 5.486 metres apart. To run on these tracks, he designed a wheeled platform driven by two 19kW motors running through drive shafts along the legs, all powered by electric cables overhead. To onlookers, it appeared as if a section of the pier had decided to abscond along the beach. Most bizarre of all, his tracks were between the tide marks, so at high tide his contraption would wade. He named this machine Pioneer, though visitors named it Daddy Longlegs. The Pioneer first ran in 1896. 6 days later, it was derailed in a storm. Nobody was hurt and the damage was repaired and service resumed. Though it proved popular as a tourist attraction, the Pioneer was never a practical mode of transport. The lines had to be constantly cleared of sand and debris that the sea would wash in, and at high tide it could barely manage 5 kilometres an hour, and it wasn't exactly nippy at the best of times. What's more, it could only run when the weather was relatively calm. In 1901, Brighton Council had coastal defences built along the beach, which required the line to be shut down. Despite Bulk's setback, electric railways were rapidly coming into their own. However, another form of railway was coming to an end, and that was the broad gauge. The 7-foot Brunel gauge had once dominated southwest England and South Wales, but over the years had been rebuilt a bit at a time to better integrate with the rest of the network, and fewer broad gauge services were being run from the main terminus in Paddington. By 1892, only the main artery from Paddington to Penzance, and a few branch lines out west, could handle broad gauge. The only thing stopping Great Western doing away with it altogether were a number of independent subsidiary companies who owned sections of track and refused to rebuild it. But in 1892, the management structure changed, bringing these sections directly under Great Western's control. They wasted no time, gathering materials and workers in trucks in sidings all along the line in preparation for a rapid operation. In May 1892, the last broad gauge service left Paddington with a great deal of ceremony. The main line was then shut down for a weekend as more than 40,000 workers set about the task of converting the track in its entirety. It was gruelling work, for which the workers were rewarded with an extra ration of tobacco. Nonetheless, the pace caused several mental breakdowns, including one man who ran into the sea and was never seen again. In the space of 2 days, they converted 679 kilometres of broad or mixed gauge track into standard gauge. Finally, Britain's mainline network was running to a single gauge. The engines and the carriages were parked in Swindon, where 21 kilometres of extra sidings had been built to accommodate them. Over the next year, the engineers there converted 132 locomotives and 426 coaches to run on standard gauge. While the lines were modernising, passenger numbers were growing all the time. In 1896, the number of annual passenger journeys passed 1 billion for the first time, passenger numbers comparable to modern day figures with a much lower population. At the turn of the century, the railways were running through almost every part of British life. Such diverse areas as travel, work, leisure, sport, culture, social breakdowns, food, economics, politics and industry had all been completely transformed as the railways spread their way across the country. And the nation that left the 19th century was a far cry from the one that had ended it. This dominance will continue into the 20th century, but just how long it could last remained to be seen. Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you would like to see more, and check out my website for more examples of my work. I am currently working on the next part of this series, and it should be with you in the next couple of months. Bye for now.